So there's been a lot of discussion lately on TikTok about what to do with Exodus 21:20, specifically in relation to how to translate verse 21. It reads, "Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property." And there's been some discussion about what it means if the slave recovers at a day or two, because whether the slave recovers after a day or two seems to be irrelevant. If they recover at all, there really shouldn't be any punishment. But some people have taken this to mean, well, if they recover, but it takes a week, there's going to be some punishment, but not the same punishment as if the slave dies as a direct result. But I think there's more happening under the hood here, and I'd like to look at it in Hebrew and really kind of get to the nuts and bolts of what we should be doing with this particular passage. In the Hebrew text, we've got a really interesting set of verbs and some dependent clauses here that I think are worth taking a look at. So we're going to do that right now. So the introduction of this is simple enough. We've got a vav or a wa conjunction with the word ki, which means for or because. And this usually gets translated as when or if. And those are both fine translations. That's because this is part of a dependent clause. So when the word because is at the beginning of a dependent clause, then in English, we usually render that as when. When something happens, X, Y, and Z would be the result of that, right? So that's easy enough to translate. But it gets a little bit interesting with the verb, yake. So this is basically the root word nakam, to strike or to smite. Okay, and this is typically something you would do as you're beating a slave. And it just happens to be that this shows up in the hafil sem. The hafil verbal stem in Hebrew is an active causative stems, meaning the subject, the man, if the man causes to strike his male or female slave with a rod and he dies. So basically what's saying here is if a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod, and because of that striking, caused by that striking, it's unalived. The male or female slave is unalived, and some translations render this immediately or at that time, but it literally says under. It says at in this translation, the NASB, but it really says under his hand, which is taken kind of literally to mean if the slave dies in the midst of the beating, which is a perfectly fine translation. So if you're beating your male or female slave with a rod and it dies as you're beating the slave, you get a really severe punishment. You get nakom, yinakim. And so this is an intensive, what we would say to like beginner learning Hebrew, this is like an intensive form of the verb, which usually means to avenge or to punish. Now, here it's listed as punished, but honestly, typically in the Old Testament, not every time, but a lot of times, this is used to describe avenging the death for like an unlawful murder or an unlawful killing. So if somebody murdered your brother or your sister, you would avenge them by killing them back. That was the punishment. And this is typically the word you would use to avenge the unlawful death of another human being. So what's being said here should be pretty clear. If you strike your male or your female slave so severely that you cause their death, what appears to be intentional, okay, then you are going to be avenged. Your life is going to be taken for their life. You're probably going to get the capital punishment. It doesn't say that. It could say that. The text could clearly say that you would die. The word for death in Hebrew is mut, and there's a couple ways to translate that into a verb that wasn't used. It just says that the death of that slave is going to be avenged. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because As we read in the NIV previously, it seems to indicate as long as the slave gets up after a day or two and survives, then there's no punishment. But I think it's more clear in the NASB and also in the Hebrew. It says, however. So these two are linked. It's saying, listen, if you intentionally kill your slave, this is what happens. However, and this is the second scenario, if a day or two, and this is where some translations will add the word after right here. If after a day or two he survives, no vengeance will be taken, for he is his property. But it's not really actually what's being said here. So what's being said here is, let's get rid of after. We're not going to supply after. We're not going to put that in here. It says if a day or two, and survive is also not quite right either. Survive, this is actually amad, which means to stand, okay? So it says, however, if a day or two he stands, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. So survive is fine too, but what's being said here, listen, is as long as he doesn't die as a direct result of the beating, if he stands or survives for a day or two, then there will be no vengeance, because that death would be accidental, not on purpose. And you do not get capital punishment. You do not get vengeance. Okay, you do not get to avenge the unlawful death of somebody if they die as an accident. And in fact, in the Old Testament, there are sanctuary cities that are set up for people who accidentally unalive other human beings, because God does not want somebody to be unalived and avenged for an accidental killing. And so this law seems to fit what we see in the rest of the Old Testament, where if you accidentally kill somebody, there is no capital punishment for you. But in this particular case, it's really interesting, because this is basically saying you can accidentally, as long as it's not immediately obvious that you killed him as a result of the beating, you can accidentally kill your slave and there will be no punishment. You don't even have to escape to a sanctuary city. Theoretically, this is codified in the law. If the slave dies after the second day, there is no punishment. There's no vengeance for the killing of this slave, because the slave is his property. It says kesef in Hebrew, which means silver. It's his money. It's his money. And so, yeah, it's actually worse than what some of the modern translations would lead you to believe. You are allowed to accidentally kill your slave. Now, I can hear some of you shouting at the screen, but Justin, that's just your interpretation. And I can promise you it's not. This is actually in many of the academic commentaries. This is one of my favorites from Nahum Sarna in the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society commentary on Exodus. And it says, should the beaten slave linger more than a day before succumbing, certain new and mitigating circumstances arise. The direct causal relationship between the master's conduct and the slave's death is now in doubt, for there may have been some unknown intermediate cause. The intent of the master appears less likely to have been homicidal and more likely to have been disciplinary. He is given the benefit of the doubt, especially since he is losing his financial investment, the price of the slave. Basically, he's saying that the owner is given the benefit of the doubt because surely the owner wouldn't want to intentionally unalive his slave. If it appears to be accidental only, there is no punishment because he is not committing a crime.